Well, today we are here for another book review. We're talking about the book The Hunger Habit by Judson Brewer, MD, PhD. Subtitle, Why We Eat When We're Not Hungry and How to Stop.
Are we a bit late to the party on this one, do you think?
Probably. I mean, I remember listening to a podcast maybe 6 months ago, and he was making the circuit at the time. I don't know how many people are still talking about it. I have kind of noticed that it doesn't come up a lot in searches, so I don't know if it kind of, if it had a lot of promise and then it sort of fell flat, or if people just are still yet to catch on to it. I know that his previous book, Unwinding Anxiety, which I had read years ago, I had really liked. I found that it had a lot of merit, and when I heard that he tackled hunger and cravings, I was not excited, actually. And I listened to, you know why? Because I don't like, I'm going to just say, I don't like when he's a psychologist and he studies habits and things. And I can understand that application to the mind and to anxiety. But I think when people cross over into food where they don't have experience with it, this is another fair burn kind of thing. I just get a little defensive, and I do that because I find that they miss things, and I don't like the generalized application of the way the mind works to translate to the way we eat, because there's other factors going on that are physiological and potentially nervous system related. They're being interpreted through this psychological lens that misses the mark a lot, and this is probably the crux of my review today. There were a lot of things he talks about that I agree with, and there were a lot of things he talks about that I found interesting and like as a new lens for me to look through. Not new, but maybe reminding me of those lenses. But he misses stuff and oversimplifies, and that always pisses me off.
I was just about to say, did anything make you mad? Save it for later. Don't reveal it all now.
Mhm.
Did you get mad?
Yeah, I took some notes, just PS. I won't tell you what they say yet, but there's some that they're dripping with sarcasm in my own notes. I'm like, oh yeah, Dr. Judd. And I've got them in all caps.
Mhm.
I wrote in one of them, in my note number 30, I'll just give you a little preview. That's preferable? Dude, it's an ED setup. Say this calmly. I gave myself a note to say this calmly because I can get very worked up about it, because I started to get all like ranty in my notes, and I was like, it's a good point, Steph, but just say it calmly.
We want to hear the energy. I think my theory is when this first came out, he had some good publicity and he got on some big shows. And also, it's very compelling. When you first hear the idea of it, it's a really compelling concept. And to be fair, he does say this, but it's a book that if you're really going to do this properly, it is a lot of work. It takes commitment once the motivation and excitement of the newness wears off. And that's something that I think, I know I certainly struggle with that in life in generally, but I just thought the structure and the order was weird. I don't understand the order.
The way that he wraps a lot of this up in a bow is like, buddy, that is not how this is going to work. And maybe I also want to name this. As I was reading it, I thought to myself, he hasn't written this for the eating disorder community. Okay, so I'm reading this through the lens of that. I need to also give him the space to be saying these things to people at large who might be in more of a disordered eating, or not even identifying with that. Some of these approaches are awfully simplistic. But I can understand the appeal to some groups of people who are dealing with food as an issue. I don't really see it applying to this community. So he starts the book out by offering some examples of people he was working with, how he came to this work. And he talks about how he was observing the clients he was working with who had food issues. He had this like revelation that they weren't eating when they were hungry, that they were eating when they weren't hungry.
Wow.
And
What
by
a
golly gee,
revelation.
it was because they were tying up their emotions in it. Gosh darn it. And mind blown. One of my first notes is, I'm just going to read you my notes. He realizes cravings aren't about hunger. Shocker. And yeah. And then I felt like, okay, this is not news to anyone. Like this is like, he's catching up with like what we all already know. So I'm like, okay, but where does he take it? So he then goes on to basically say that we need to unwire these emotional crossovers that we've got with our hunger, and that our cues to eat are coming from some kind of emotional wiring that has become a habit in the system. And we do that through awareness. And by cultivating more awareness in methods that I know that sounds like a simplistic mindfulness kind of approach, but he goes into it and he articulates it, I think, with merit in a lot of ways. But that when you create awareness, you will see that actually you're not getting the reward you think that you are from the food. And therefore, your logical brain will be like, again, gosh darn it, I don't need this food. And all will be well. And you will only crave healthy food because you will see that eating sugar doesn't make you feel good.
On that front, when he started out, I felt like the book started with such promise. He says in the introduction, he says, I'm not a fan of good bad language because it causes us to praise and blame ourselves for something that our brains do at a very basic survival level. So as one of the first changes you'll make, I'll ask you to use the words helpful and unhelpful instead of good or bad. And then stand by, Stefanie.
Mm-hmm.
Stand by.
I know where you're going because I read the rest of the book.
Not once does he refer to the foods as helpful or unhelpful for the rest of the book.
Not once.
And right near the end of the book, on page 219, he says, yes, awareness not only helps you become disenchanted with unhealthy types and amounts of food, but it also helps you become more enchanted with those that serve your health and well-being. You don't have to tell yourself what food to eat or avoid. Your body will do this for you as long as you build your awareness, paying attention to the results. The bonus is that this becomes a virtuous cycle between your body and mind. He's talking about getting rid of good and bad, and then he's talking about virtuous cycles.
Yes, he is. Absolutely.
It's a mixed message.
And throughout the book, he cites, and this was my biggest problem with the book, and I have so many examples of it. He continues to polarize food groups. He's very Michael Pollan. The lack of insight on that, to me, was actually what made me the most mad, because he started out by saying that that's not helpful, which it's not. And again, I was like, okay, good. But then he demonizes all sorts of food and clearly has a bias against processed foods and sugar. He also talks about his wife having a struggle with food. It sounds like something of a diet culture infiltration, like quite a bit. And I couldn't help but think this might be something in your house. This might be the water you're swimming in too, Dr. Judd. Like, you know what I mean? Like that is something, you have this awareness of it from an intellectual perspective, that good, bad foods and shaming and guilt and restriction aren't helpful, but you're very much entrenched in it, because the way that he speaks about things like gummy worms, he talks about at one point the cheese crackers, like the packets of the orange cheese crackers on the airplane. I really want to mention this. He says that one time he used his own method. He got on an airplane and he flew over the time that would have been his lunch. He did not bring his avocado sandwich like he normally does, so he didn't have a lunch that day. They offered him these cheese crackers and he was about to take them because he was hungry and he was going to miss lunch. And then he used his method and decided to reject those gross synthetic orange cheesy crackers, which means that he went hungry, which means that he skipped lunch instead of eating when he was hungry, that's disordered. And he used the rationale of, I did a good thing because I avoided processed food because I knew my body wouldn't appreciate it. But this is running very counter to the idea that when our body's hungry, you just need food. And it's kind of saying the moral thing to do is to go hungry and wait until you can get your avocado sandwich, which is extremely problematic.
That was my sense the whole way through, is that it was this whole eating when you're hungry is good. And if you're eating when you're not hungry, you're reinforcing a habit that's not helpful. Now, to be fair and to give him some credit, and maybe we should talk about some of the things that perhaps we did like. I really liked how he talked about getting in touch with the body and getting into the body, and that focusing on checking in with the body. And it is also throughout the book, this idea of letting yourself be not the decider, but relying on your own experience to build up. But the whole time he's implying what that experience outcome is going to look like, and what the best outcome is. You will move towards this.
Correct.
You'll move away from that. It also, sorry, I'm supposed to be talking about the things that I like, but it also treats...
I know. I got to get it out of the way.
It also treats our brains like this. It works on the whole. We learn by reinforcement, negative and positive reinforcement. So if we can just be aware enough to know, so that when we play it out in advance, we go, oh, I know that if I binge on all these foods, I'm going to feel terrible. And now I don't have to battle with myself. My brain and my body goes, no, we're not going to do that. And I was fully aware of how I felt after a binge. I don't think I was
Totally.
believing it was gonna be rewarding, sometimes depending on the type of binge, but many binges where I didn't, and I didn't care. I almost wanted to feel bad, or
And
I
that
was
made you
just
feel
in
worse.
well, sorry?
And
What do
that
you
would
mean?
make you feel worse, right? How many times do you hear people say, why do I do this to myself? I know I'm going to suffer. Like, I know this isn't what I want. And yet I keep doing it anyway. Like
Yes.
that. Why aren't we learning essentially from that negative reinforcement? This is a feeling of guilt people carry.
Yeah, it suggests that our brains are just very rational about this stuff, which is a bit problematic. I wanna say one thing, when he talked about mindful eating, the section on mindful eating, there was quite a bit of that I quite liked. One of the things I really liked is that
Hmm.
mindful eating doesn't have to be slow.
Yes, I loved that part.
You can eat quickly and still be aware.
He talks about how professional athletes or athletes are very mindful in their, when in the pursuit of the ball or something, but they're going at a high speed, right? I thought that was a really great way of
Yeah.
articulating and illustrating that point, like that mindfulness isn't always just slow and measured. It also can be quite fast and high energy, but it's about the focus, or it's about the attention.
Mhm. And he talks about retrospective mindfulness as well. So sometimes you are just gonna blow through it and taking a bit of time afterwards to pause and reflect and to wonder. He also does bang on, to be fair, he bangs on about self-kindness all the way through it,
Yeah.
and I really liked that too. Oh, can I tell you my favorite bit of the book? Oh, my favorite bit of the book
Yeah.
is what he spoke about with curiosity. I don't know if you remember very well what he wrote about curiosity, but
Uh,
sometimes
yes.
when you hear something and you're like, "Oh my goodness, yes." It feels like a light bulb moment. You already knew it, and then someone's put it into words in a way that you haven't heard before, and you're like, "It made so much sense." So he talks about the importance of curiosity. I talk about the importance of curiosity. He brought forward a distinction between two types of curiosity that was originally the ideas of Jordan Littman and Paul Sylvia, and that was two types, one being interest curiosity and the other being deprivation curiosity. And I just want to read out the way he's written it because I
Mhm.
don't think I'm going to summarize it any better. So Judson writes, deprivation curiosity feels closed down and narrows our focus. Find that information fast. We ignore everything that seems superfluous. We're on a mission, driven to get that piece of information. Interest curiosity opens us up to the experience. We don't feel rushed because we're focused on the process of learning. The joy of discovery feels good by itself. It is intrinsically rewarding because we don't have to get anything to feel its rewards. Deprivation is about destination. When you get that piece of information that you've been lacking, you're done. Mission accomplished. Interest is about the journey. Even if you have a specific destination in mind, you are enjoying the process of learning. And that to me makes a difference in recovery. The people who can develop that interest, curiosity in recovery are the ones that stay the course. And those
Mhm.
that are in that deprivation, it's often quite a panicked place where you feel very dysregulated. I've got a lot of compassion for people in it
Yes.
because believe me, I've been there. But it's the people who will write under my YouTube videos, but you're not telling me what to do. But how do I stop? I watched this video to expect to learn how to stop, and you didn't tell me how to stop doing this. And
Yeah.
I loved that. That for me was my favorite bit of the book and actually made the book worth reading for me because
It was
I'm
at
going to
the
refer
end.
back. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was quite interesting. I read that last night. What you just said and the analysis of the curiosity and the different access points we have to it is the crux of my entire binge eating recovery philosophy itself. And this is what I think that these kind of books miss, that I always feel like I have to be the spokesman for. You might very well feel differently than me because we've talked about this before, but like my binge eating came from this very dysregulated place that until I had some kind of regulation going on in my body, I couldn't access any of these things that a lot of people who, especially people who identify with just binge eating, talk about as useful, and these tools that are helpful, these mindful kind of activities, just simply misses the mark for people who have a foundation of work to do around dysregulation. This is going to also be true for people in trauma. He does talk about that at the end, and I actually like he names that, but he names it in the context of trauma in particular. But I think it's more than that. I think that some people who are binging are absolutely dysregulated chronically. And that this ability to be curious in that way, this ability to be mindful, he uses the raisin example, which is that famous like pay attention, take 20 minutes to eat a raisin essentially and notice it. That experiment, I had to do it once in an eating disorder treatment place. And I remember my blood was boiling inside. I remember trying to keep cool on the outside, and I was furious because these kind of tools are actually counterproductive for people who are that dysregulated. It makes them mad. And that is so missed in a lot of approaches with binge eating experts. And again, he's not a binge eating expert. He's talking about eating, but I think a lot of people who read these books are very dysregulated. Not everybody, but a lot of people are. And when you are, and you're reading these kind of things and you're very hopeful, they're ultimately extremely discouraging and disappointing and disheartening, and you become really dejected feeling inside because it doesn't work for you. And you don't understand why, because logically you completely get it. And you're like, I'm just broken because I get it, but I can't do it. And that's because I think there's this missing piece of addressing that regulation that nobody talks about. Like, not nobody, but a lot of experts don't talk about it. And it's 101. It's going to happen before this other stuff is possible. So while I found myself really liking a lot of what he said, it came from the part of me that is like, yes, because I'm regulated now and I can factor these things in, and these things are very helpful once you're regulated. But I just want to speak to anybody who is listening or has read this book where this stuff that might not work for you, and that is a lot of the reason why. And I think that addressing that first is going to be imperative before this stuff works, and I say that a lot, but I can't stop seeing it and naming it. So I guess my caveat to this entire episode is that would be my first layer. And then I can talk about what I liked, but only understanding that it comes after that first layer would be addressed.
You mean you don't think the 8 pages he wrote about trauma in it was enough?
Look, I felt, again, I had to keep reminding myself that he's not writing this necessarily to people with trauma. Like, he's not supposing that he's writing to an eating disorder community or a trauma community. And sometimes I have to check myself to remember that there's a population outside of the one I work with. You know what I mean? And that people struggle with food in all sorts of places in life, in all pockets of society that aren't dealing with those things. But a lot of people are, and a lot of people who are reading this book are, because the people who need the most help are those people, and maybe not the most, but maybe, and they're looking for answers. And so they're going to the experts, and this is what the experts say. And this is another kind of one of those, like, he's a white, wealthy male who never actually struggled with this. He only struggled with things insofar as his moral clean eating. And that is reiterated over and over again. And by the way, I thought part of me was like, is a lot of this, the science behind this being manipulated itself by a bias of food morality? Because some of the examples he gives, for example, he talks about a client who, gosh darn it, I keep saying gosh darn it just to indicate my sarcasm, but like she kept eating to regulate her. He kind of alludes to this regulating concept. He doesn't call it that. What I took as to regulate your nervous system. He talks about this in the beginning with this girl, and he says she kept eating carrots and cucumbers because she was looking for the crunch and she just couldn't get satisfied. And a part of me was thinking, if somebody's eating a lot of carrots and cucumbers, might they just not be eating enough? Or might they have like a moralization around, like vegetables that you're not factoring into this study data? You know what I mean? He talks about that a lot. He uses a lot of his own bias about food to draw conclusions about why somebody's eating something or not, or why they're not getting satisfied. And it's like, did you look into the fact that you might be restricting, or they might be restricting, and that's why they're not getting satisfied? Like that is missed. And it can't, like, that's why I'm like, okay. I said I'd say it calmly.
At least Fairburn did make a thing out of restriction. There is decent real estate in his book, in his program, to at least talk about restriction and nod to it. You say this is not for people with eating disorders, but he ran groups of people which he says had binge eating disorder. And he says the book is not suitable for anyone with anorexia and bulimia, which just speaks to one of the things that winds me up just culturally about eating disorders, that binge eating disorder is seen as the lesser one. Anorexia and bulimia, that's much more serious. We wouldn't expect you to recover from those things on your own, but if you've got binge eating, here, have a book and go help yourself. Which also brings me on to a factor that is not mentioned that I think is critical in a lot of his positive data. He worked with groups. So he worked with people who are able to be in spaces where they were heard and understood and wouldn't feel shame because they had people around who got it. And I think some of this stuff that is so hard to do, to be able to become more present around food, to be able to challenge our judgment and our shame, doing that on our own is incredibly difficult. Insert link for our community. And I'll just add on the back of that I also run monthly groups, 3-hour one-off groups that you can come along to, and then you come to free monthly support meetings going forward. And I'm going to pop that in the description below. I don't know if I've ever promoted my groups, these particular groups on the podcast, but I would like to today.
Go for it, girl. Don't talk like that.
You've never sounded more American.
I know.
I have a huge issue. This was the bit that got me mad with the examples that he uses. So Jackie, who appears a couple of times, she appears at the beginning, and Jackie is in her puberty years or young years. She's restricting. And she's losing weight at a time that she's growing. And then she gets together with a friend and she starts binging because of negative emotions. This is what he puts it down to. It's negative emotions.
Yeah.
And then in his chapter where he's talking about the craving monster, how not to feed the craving monster, he talks again about Jackie. And I've got to read it because I couldn't believe what I was reading. For Jackie, cravings were less like a sweet inner toddler having a tantrum and more like a raving monster in capital letters. During the periods of her life when Jackie was restricting the types and amounts of food she ate, she would find herself bothered by persistent thoughts of I could have this or that, and then goes on to talk about how this is cravings, and then back onto the craving monster. Mm. And I'm like, are you kidding me? You've just said she's restricting the type and amount she's eating, thinking of food all the time, and that means she's thinking of food she doesn't need. One more. When he talks about slip-ups, great. Yes, slip-ups, such an important part of recovery. Let's talk about slip-ups. I'm sure he would actually have some really good examples of this, and he chooses to use Jack. Jack, who goes to a Mexican restaurant and decides to get a large salad. And when he begins eating, he pays attention and notices that his wanting is ebbing. He's approaching his pleasure plateau. I was eating and realized that I was filling up, fuller than I needed to be. He told himself he was full, but he kept eating. And then he goes on to have this whole retrospective look back at this with Jack. Is it possible that he was just volume eating in that moment? He might have really wanted a salad. And of course, I don't know what the salad was like. Maybe the salad was substantial enough, but this is not even a discussion point about how we can feel full, not have enough energy, how we can have deprived ourselves for 6 months, be eating to the point of discomfort, still wanting to eat. Well, that's just cravings. Let's ride these out like cravings.
Yes.
This is the piece. Okay.
Correct.
Right.
And I think that's irresponsible. Not to have any mention of that, it's damaging. I know this because it was how I felt reading stuff like this. And like there's not a mention. And I think it comes from, I don't care if you have an MD or a PhD, sometimes you don't have all the information. And that, especially if I just don't know that you can translate. I get it. I get that we're looking for data. And I get that some people are going to be helped by this, but it's like, I don't know that this person is an expert in this area enough to talk about it in a responsible way. When it comes to food, it's just different than talking about other psychological concepts because you're talking about a physiological concept too. And another example like that was where he talks about the hunger test. He's using awareness to see if you're really hungry or if like it's a craving. And he says, and again, in some places this is going to work and in others it won't. But he says, if you're feeling hungry, essentially, and you look back and you realize that you've eaten like just a few hours ago, well, then you're not hungry. And you just ate. So that's why you know you're not hungry, because you have that data. And that's not true. Sometimes, especially for dieters, which I gotta assume are a large amount of people who are going to be reading a book like this, they're eating as little as possible. So yes, maybe they just ate a few hours ago, but you know how many clients I have who come to me and when they tell me what they're eating, like there's not enough. Like that's why, because you're eating the bare minimum breakfast and then you're hungry 2 hours later. So this is driving a person potentially towards pathologizing true hunger because they're like, well, I just had breakfast, but I had a piece of toast or, a hard-boiled egg or whatever. You know what I mean? The other thing he does is he talks about his own experience of like how if you pay attention you will realize that you actually want blueberries instead of, what was the other thing?
Gummy
He's got
worms.
these two things, and he's like, maybe it was the gummy worms. He offers a different example too, and he says, by paying attention to the disenchantment of the gummy worms or whatever, which is always a processed food. We always become disenchanted with the processed foods, which I would beg to differ. Like, I feel like if a lot of people went through this, they'd be like, no, I get a lot of reward from that. Like, what are you talking about? I don't feel disgusted by it. You'll realize that blueberries are a better offer. He calls it something. What is it called?
Bigger,
BBO?
better offer.
Bigger, better offer. And he basically is like, you'll see by listening to your body that gummy worms are gross and blueberries are the bigger, better offer. And you're going to be like, gosh darn it, I want those blueberries instead of the gummy worms. So I'm thinking about this and I'm like, okay, for some people, there might be a true body connection of like, I've done this with certain candy bars where I used to binge on them a lot. And now when I eat them, I actually do feel like the taste of them isn't what I remember them to be. But that's sometimes. Like every time I eat ice cream, I am still just as pleased. This is wonderfully delicious. And there's no way that I'm going to be like, ice cream, versus strawberries, and be like, my body just prefers the strawberries, because he's neglecting the whole taste and dopamine. Like, there is a certain amount of physiological pleasure we get from foods that are processed. It does happen. So I think what he's doing is he's rewarding himself with his own bias of what's good, what's making him good versus bad, and using that as the reward. He's calling the disenchantment with that food based on some kind of physiological response. I think it's a psychological response. I think he's like, ooh, processed food. Oh, yuck. Oh, good job, Dr. Judd. He's actually associating the response he's having with his morality, not with the actual body response.
It annoys me with the gummy worms example that he uses. So he basically says that he builds up this desire for gummy worms. He finds he's eating a lot of them, so he's craving them. And this is the only example, and by his own admission, he's like, this is the only example he's got in his life that he can relate this to. So he's like, I can relate to you with your binge eating disorder because I once got carried away with gummy worms and just found myself in a craving cycle. It really, it just feels,
Yeah.
the comparison piece I find a bit difficult. But do you know what bothered me? So the hunger test, going back to the hunger test that he's put. So what he does is he writes this list of, let's say, experiences. So it's like the list is boredom, avoiding something, restless, tense, overwhelmed, difficulty concentrating, moody, headache, irritable or easily frustrated, stomach growling or rumbling or gurgling, dizzy or lightheaded, and stomach empty. And then he does 3 columns, which he has stress, habit, and hunger. So as you're going through these things, whether you're feeling tense or difficulty concentrating, you have to decide, is this coming from stress? Is it coming from habit? Is it coming from hunger? And he does recognize that something can come from both. So a headache could be stress and emotion, and it could be hunger. So you've got these columns. So headache would get a tick under stress and emotion, and it would get a tick under hunger. And then some of them less so. So restless, he's only got stress and emotion, doesn't come under hunger, according to this. And then the way you're supposed to interpret it is add up your scores. Now, I appreciate there might be an element of, well, this just doesn't sound like common sense. But if somebody were to apply this in a very black and white way, they could tick that their stomach was growling, rumbling, or gurgling, and their stomach was empty. 2 ticks for hunger. But then they could also be having like boredom, restless, tense, and overwhelmed. And then their scores are going to skew that. And it's going to go, oh no, it's more
Yeah.
of an emotional thing than a hunger thing. I don't think he talks about stress and emotion and hunger happening at the same time. And that's a massive miss. A massive miss to suggest it's this.
Yeah.
I mean, he does say that something can come under both, but ultimately you're trying to decide where your hunger's coming to know whether you're going to label it as craving or label it as I need to eat.
Yeah. There was a post recently by dietitian Anna on Instagram, which I actually shared, and I want to that speaks right to that. She said, if you're hungry when you're emotionally eating, you're not eating emotionally. You're hungry, right? So it's kind of like you can have emotions when you're hungry. And by that example, you're going to decide that you're emotionally eating, but you're just hungry and having emotions. That doesn't mean that the eating is coming from the need to suppress those emotions. The eating is coming from your hunger. It's not either or. It's not like you're either hungry or you're emotionally eating. You can absolutely, and many times, and I find this to be true very much, people are oftentimes blaming their emotions for why they're eating when it's oftentimes hunger based, especially people who are really desperate to stop eating because there's a lot of trying to control that hunger. But I don't think that he is being intentionally manipulative. I don't think he's trying to push his data, from an ego perspective and ignore these other points. I think he's missing parts. I think he's unaware of parts. And I also think, I just had it and I just ruined the page, but I think a lot of it speaks to the bias, his own bias of potentially just like the way his brain works. There's so much logic in here. There was a paragraph that said, basically, you just have to collect data to show that what you're doing by eating is not helpful. And once you can see that through this data, you won't want to do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I would venture to guess that everybody listening to this podcast episode right now has already gotten that information. Like, I don't think anyone is sitting here like, oh my gosh, I just didn't realize that the eating wasn't solving my problem.
And also, there are times when he's saying, you'll realize that actually the eating doesn't make you feel better, or it doesn't solve the emotional problem or whatever. And I would say that there are times in my life where it certainly felt like it has. The reward that I got from like compulsively eating or numbing with food, it did that for me. And that was what I wanted and felt like I needed at that time because I didn't feel like I could cope. So again, it's this assumption that food, it's not as rewarding as you think it is. And if you pay more attention, you'll realize that. But if it isn't working for you and you realize it, there's going to be a natural move away from that. And I think that there is, again, like to use your kind of language, if you're in a very regulated place, because he talks a lot about noting. Right. You note how you're feeling, you note what's going on in your body. It's this it's coming back to yourself over and over again. But I don't think he really acknowledges how much noise is in someone's head. There's one short chapter dedicated to the committee, which is all the voices in your head. And his answer is label the voices as like, this is the judging voice, this is the shame voice, this is this voice. And by labeling it, you separate yourself from it. Well, I'm all for that. But it's this, here's a few pages, just do this and just start disidentifying. Because you're paying attention, you will be able to disidentify. There's an assumption there as well. Because I think that people who really get something out of mindfulness, that is their experience. But for others that perhaps mindfulness just doesn't do that for them, or they're wired differently, it's a slightly different personality type, I'm not sure that will happen.
Or it's just not accessible yet. Again, I couldn't use mindfulness until now, Mm-hmm. He has a craving tool. He says, and there's, again, nothing inherently bad about this. It's just that it takes a certain amount of regulation to be in this place. He says, pay attention to why you want to eat right now. Is it hunger, emotions, boredom, etc.? Pay attention to what you are about to eat. What is it made up of? What does it look and smell like? Pay attention as you eat each bite to the qualities of it. And then keep paying attention until you finish eating. He also talks about he does say, like, don't restrict. Like, really, you have to give yourself permission to eat the thing and to not be sitting there sort of telling yourself you shouldn't be. He does give a paragraph to saying, really, really accept that you're going to eat this because that's the only way you can pay attention. And he's right. Except I think that paragraph could have been a book. You know what I mean? Like, there's the issue. But then he says you follow up with saying, okay, now how much did you eat? Way too much, right amount, too little, none. Checking in with your body. How do you feel on the scale of 0 to 10? Checking in with your emotions. How do you feel on a scale of 0 to 10? I'm sorry. Yes. Minus 10 to 10. Right. Again, these are tools that could be very helpful and useful. But then the idea is that once you collect enough of this data, you'll see, and that's the supposition, that you'll see that actually what's happening is that you're at minus 10. You're disenchanted with the eating most of the time. And that should be enough to sort of be like, all right, well then, let's just not do that. Like that. And that's just an extremely simplistic, reductionistic way of looking at it. But he also makes this distinction that I do like, and I think is useful, between, he says, when you follow up with that later, you ask yourself, what am I getting from this? And how content do I feel? And he differentiates between satisfaction and contentment, which I thought was an interesting part. He said that if you're looking to see if you're satisfied, you might say yes. Like you might kind of feel like, yes, like my stomach is full. I think that's the way he's actually thinking about satisfaction. like I'm full. But then he says, ask yourself how content you are, which would to me indicate the absence of white knuckling, like contentment being, I feel peaceful. I feel peaceful about what I've eaten, and that's a distinction. I thought that tool in a vacuum was pretty good. I don't think it's helpful in the way he's assuming it will be helpful, because a lot of people are not going to reach contentment, because that's, again, the problem. But I liked the differentiation of I'm full, but I'm not content.
And to add to that, he says, the only way to calibrate the system, find that actual contentment, is through positive and negative prediction errors.
Again, maybe that's why this book didn't take off. I don't know if more people, I don't know anyone else who's reviewed it. I don't know what the feedback on this is, but not my cup of tea, not my cup of gummy worms.
I think all the tools in here, and he offers a lot of tools, a lot of exercises that you can go away and do around this mindfulness, around food. And I think that all of those tools, I think the hunger test could use some work, I think are really good. I actually think that what he's offering for people to do to check in with themselves is really good. Unfortunately, it's presented within this container of this is what the outcome should be. The outcome should be that you want less of this and you want more of that. Even though he does say in the book that you need to let go of the outcome, and then repeatedly says what the outcome will be. And for people who have a lot of food noise, who are trying to figure this stuff out, that makes it challenging. So I think that there's a lot in here that's good. There's a lot of good concepts. I think the packaging is like he's hidden razor blades in there, and so it's just a little bit dangerous for some people to unwrap.
Just one other thing I liked was that he talks about dopamine, which we're going to be talking more about soonish. That dopamine makes us want things, but that wanting is different than liking, which I thought was a really interesting.
The liking versus wanting. He uses this example. He says, start with something simple. Think of a shirt or a sweater in your closet that you like. Notice the pleasant feeling you experience when you think of it. Now think of a type of food that you like. Does it automatically trigger an urge to eat it now, or can you simply stay with the feeling of liking it? My guess is that thinking of the food item you like can trigger an urge or want. Why doesn't whatever item of clothing that's hanging in your closet do the same thing? Well, you already have it. You own it. If you want to explore liking versus wanting more, you can think of a clothing item you've seen someone wearing or in a catalogue that you really liked but you don't have. No, this doesn't work, because when we think of food, our brain chemistry is affected by that. It's linked to our appetite and our primal survival in a way of thinking of some shirt that's hanging in my closet does not. And so he uses these ridiculous examples to try and make a point that just doesn't land. Okay, now I'm done.
Okay. And that reinforces what I said earlier about you cannot translate common psychological concepts to food, because there is a very big difference between shirts and appetites. You can't ignore the difference.
Agreed.
Period. Okay. If you have any other books you'd like us to review, let us know.
Yeah. We've got a couple in the pipeline. We've got Ultra Processed People.
We do?
That one's in the pipeline.
Yeah.
What's the other one?
That's right.
We want to do Never Binge Again by Glenn Livingstone.
Was that the guy you know?
I don't know.
I have that written in my notes as
I know
the guy you know.
Sarah knows all about this guy. I don't know him. We've never spoken.
In my head, you do. So I'm like, because I've never heard of him, and I'm like, we'll do that book review on the guy Sarah knows. That's how it's written in our upcoming roster.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So then don't tell us what books you want us to review, because we have enough. I can't read any more books right now. So come back to us in the fall. All right. We will see you later. Hope that was helpful.
See you later.
Bye.